Welcome, everybody, to Reaper Point Volcanology, a narrative series. Please clear some time, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Assembly 2. It was another early morning for me. Sarah was already bringing the last bits of gear out from her room by the time I plodded downstairs sleepy-eyed. "Morning, Kev." "Morning," I croaked while grabbing supplies to make coffee out of the cupboards. She proceeded to bring a couple more items out of her room and stuff her pack in silence while I brewed coffee. When she finished, there were only a couple larger items left lying around her backpack that wouldn't fit. Among them was a large rectangular red battery pack about the size of a textbook, a coil of rope, and a pair of oversized black walkie-talkies. I began sipping on my coffee. "So what are we even doing today? You never gave me the details." "Oh, sorry about that. We're putting in some new seismographic probes in the ground on the far side to get better resolution on our tomography scans." I paused. "'Kay, I know what some of those words mean." She laughed. "Don't worry about the technical details. I've got most of what we need in my backpack if you can take these last couple things." She pointed at the remaining loose items. "Sure." She continued. "That reminds me. We'll need to swing by the engineering center to pick up the probes, so bring your ID." I reached down into a special slim pocket of my pants on the right hip and slid out my ID, holding it between two fingers and displaying it to Sarah. "Should have known you'd have that sorted," she retorted. I shrugged and grinned while slipping it back into place. I went back upstairs to grab my backpack. It perpetually contained a couple often needed items like basic first aid and a multi-tool. I added to that an extra layer of clothes, an oblong insulated water bottle, and tucked my phone into a side pocket. I checked the temperature on the display before I left the room. It read 10 below 0 Celsius. Warm, I thought. I returned downstairs with my backpack and laid it down next to Sarah's by the front door. "Hey, Sarah!" I hollered to her in her room while I started picking up the battery, rope, and communications devices. "Yeah?" She peeked her head out. "Anything else you can think of that I should grab?" She thought. "Maybe a snack. We'll be out past lunchtime." I liked the idea. I wandered over to the freezer and grabbed out 2 large foil-wrapped bars. I tucked them both into a hard-shelled internal pocket of my backpack so they wouldn't get crushed. Having our gear collected, we donned our thermal suits and helmets before throwing on our backpacks and heading out the front door. We walked the short distance from our house to the lift in silence. The helmets made it difficult to converse while outside. We hopped in one of the ascending gondolas at the platform, and I shrugged off my backpack for the ride. I ratcheted up the visor to take in some fresh air. It was a little too warm for it. "Thanks again for coming with me today." Sarah broke the silence. "Happy to help," I replied. And I was, for the most part. I didn't have anything else to do today. "So what happened to your assistants you normally go with?" Sarah leaned back on the bench across the gondola. "Have you met Gia and Katrina?" "I'm not sure. I don't think so." "Well, they're both transfers from down south, so they aren't here permanently. I don't think they like the cold field work here and tend to find excuses to get out of the overtime weekend expeditions. They come from the same prestigious prep school, so they can come off a little stuck up." "Oh, wait. What do they look like?" "Gia is like mid-height, short black hair and thick glasses. Katrina is about your height with long black hair, likes to wear white pants a lot." "Oh, yeah, I've seen her before. The shop guys were making fun of her wearing them in the shop when she stopped by to pick up some parts once." "I'm sure that went well." "Yeah, and of course she heard. No one ever accused those guys of being subtle. Never seen someone that infuriated so quickly." "She probably just hated having to go down there in the first place." "Guess so." The gondola was approaching branch 15, and I shrugged my backpack on again in preparation for departure. The engineering center was the first building on the right of the Branch 15 platform. The administration center was the first building across Trunk Street on the left of Branch 15. They were long, identical buildings with flat front faces. The engineering center had a large backlit metal sign with the acronym RPVE, and the administration building had the same style of sign displaying RPVA. We walked up to the side of the engineering building to an access door with a badge reader next to it. Sarah walked up and swiped her ID. The reader beeped, flashed green, and the door unlocked with a click. Sarah opened the door and propped it open with her boot. "You should scan in too, so I can put you on payroll for today." She motioned towards the scanner. I fumbled through my layers of clothes to retrieve my card and swiped it. Sarah flipped on the lights in the lab, and the whole room came into view at once. It was about 5 meters deep by 9 meters wide. Stainless steel benches, carts, and shelves lit by unnaturally blue lights gave the room a very clinical vibe. Despite this, the room wasn't orderly. Various half-assembled electromechanical devices littered every open surface. Schematics and drawings hung from hooks next to their respective projects. I gawked at the clutter while Sarah strode over to a vertical storage rack on the far side of the room. It contained long rod-like devices with a sharp chisel on one end and various electrical connectors and antennae on the other end. They were about a meter long and tapered from 3 to 10 centimeters in diameter. Sarah picked 3 out and clamped them together with a large hinged metal device from a nearby table. "Get over here," she barked, probably half to keep me from touching anything as I wandered around the room. I waddled over dumbly, and she gripped my shoulder to spin me around. She clipped the bundle to the back of my pack, and I nearly fell over as she dropped the weight. "Good Lord, what are these things made of?" exclaiming at the extra mass. "Stainless steel." "Makes sense for the application, but jeez," I complained while readjusting my backpack straps to the new weight. "Emily's team actually just finished the redesign of these. You should complain to her." "Oh, really? I always forget what she does. She never really talks about it." "Well, I guess she only handled the electrical design, so the joke doesn't really work, but whatever." Sarah waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, right, nearly forgot." Sarah crossed the room and grabbed a high-visibility yellow reflective vest from a hook on the wall. "You need to be visible. It's policy." I stared at it while she held it out. "You couldn't have remembered before you strapped 20 extra kilos to me?" She chuckled. "Here, it's fine." She started draping the vest over my neck on top of my backpack and pulled my arms through the armholes. It left the majority of the fabric bunched up behind my neck, and the front was splayed and tilted at strange angles. I felt about as silly as I must have looked. I gave her a disgruntled frown and accepted my fate, not willing to ditch the pack to fix it. "You look dashing," she teased, while mock dusting off my new outfit. "Thanks." "We got everything we need. You ready to head out?" "Hey, wait. Why do I get all the extra shit?" I complained lamely. "Because we'll be tethered. I'll be leading the way, and if I fall in a fissure or a deep snow pit, I need you to be the anchor." She poked my midsection. "You're not nearly enough weight on your own." I snorted a laugh. That makes me feel great. We took the lift higher up the mountain. Despite being on one of the upper levels of branches, we were only about 2/3 the way to the summit. The communications station was the only building not part of the branch system and the highest building of the city. It was responsible for all signals going in and out of the city and was the upper termination of the east and west lifts. The massive antennae marking the location of the building could be seen reaching into the cloud layer from our location. Blinking red lights lined its length. It would be several minutes to reach it from Branch 15, so I took the time during the ride to take my pack off and readjust my vest. The communications building itself began to crest into view as we elevated the last couple 100 meters. The building was a stout, square, single story with a couple windows dotting the exterior walls. It was a dozen meters from the antennae itself and had a massive bundle of electrical cables spanning the distance, half buried in snow. The lift terminated in a large, corrugated metal shed to the left of the communications building. The gondolas entered through one opening, got redirected within, and sent back down the mountain out the other opening. Just before the shed, there was a large concrete platform where we exited the lift back onto solid ground. We trudged through the calf-deep snow between the platform and building. I took a moment to enjoy the elevated view over the city. Snow was being swept in wisps and ribbons from the rooftops. The dense pine forests that surrounded the city and mountain were a white-dusted coniferous ocean. Everything had a sense of unreality from our vantage point in the heavens. Sarah kicked open the front door to the building and stomped off the snow from her boots as she entered. I followed. Behind the desk at the far side of the room, a young man a little older than me was mid-drag on a vaporizer. He quickly yanked the device out of his mouth and stuffed it in a pocket to hide it. "Dr. Beckman?" He acknowledged her. His voice muffled by the vapor that was still spilling out of his mouth. He tried to disperse it surreptitiously, but was failing. We took off our helmets, and he was noticeably uncomfortable with the lingering silence in the room. His hands were stuffed firmly in the pockets of his olive-green bomber jacket, and he couldn't choose which one of us to look at. Sarah broke the silence first. "Joseph, you know you're not allowed to be high on the clock. This isn't the first time," she said with an accusatory tone. "Yeah, easy for you to say when you're not sitting up here alone all day." "Sure is, and I know that even if I tell you not to, you're just going to be doing it again as soon as I leave." He shrugged. "What would it take to get you to stop?" "Get me off this shift. Shit sucks." He slouched further in his chair. "You know I can't do that. It's literally in the job description when you signed up." He acted like he didn't even register what Sarah just said. "Yo, you know what would be sick? Could you get a TV up here?" "You're really asking me that?" Sarah replied incredulously. She then thought about it for a second. "You know what? As long as you get rapid drug tested every lunch, I could get one up here. Soon as you start missing testing, I'm taking it right back down." Joseph mulled it over for a second. "That's the best you'll get. Deal?" He accepted. Deal. There was a pause in conversation. "Who's your new buddy?" He mentioned my way and stood up. "Kev," I interjected, and held out a hand to shake. "Good to meet you." He reached across the table. "Likewise, man." The interaction gave me a better look at him. He had long brown hair tied back into a messy bun, and patchy stubble lining his chin. His faded black jeans added to a generally grungy aesthetic. Sarah piped up again. "Could you fire up the west lift for us? We're going down to plant some probes." "Yeah, no problem." Joseph walked over to a massive switchboard on the wall near the desk. Among the hundreds of switches were numerous blinking lights and gauges. All of it looked at least a couple decades old. I was partially surprised it all still worked. He flipped a couple small toggle switches and threw a large lever on the wall. A muffled whine of an electric motor and a low rumble began to ramp up. "You still using channel 8 for comms?" he asked while gripping a dial on the wall. Sarah affirmed and turned to me. "Hey Kev, grab those walkie-talkies I had you bring." I slipped off my pack, thankful to get the weight off, and rummaged around for them. Once acquired, I handed one to Sarah, and she started prodding the buttons on the front face. She pulled out a short, coiled wire from a side compartment on the device, and traded the handset for the one I still had. I had seen the connector shape on the end of the wire before. I grabbed my helmet and turned the opening upward. There was a female connector built into the front chin bar, and I experimentally held up the two ends to one another. Sarah had finished what she was doing on the other device. "Ah, you found it. Good." "I can't believe I never knew what these were for," I said as I plugged the two together. "All right, time for a comms check," she said. not replying to my previous statement. She slipped her helmet back on, and I copied. She pressed a large button on the side of the handset, and I heard, "Test, test," loudly through the shrill metallic speakers within my helmet. She pointed at me, and I found the same button on my device. I repeated, "Test, test," back to her, unsure of what else to say. She gave me a thumbs up. Joseph leaned over to a gooseneck mic on his desk and turned it towards himself. "Comm station to Tyrant and New Boy, over," rang through my helmet. Sarah yanked her helmet off. "Watch it, Joe." He held his hands up defensively. "Just joking around, sorry." Sarah slid her helmet back on and turned a knob on her walkie-talkie. "Dr. Beckman to comm station, over," boomed omnipresent from speakers embedded in the room's ceiling. She pulled her helmet off again and turned to me. "Get your pack on. We're burning daylight." Sarah was clearly getting hurt, and I wasn't willing to be in the crosshair, so I hoisted it back on in silence and waited for her to exchange a couple last words with Joseph before we left. The west lift was a couple dozen meters behind the building. We waded through the snow again to reach it, with some of the snowdrifts reaching knee height. Another concrete pad aided ingress into the gondolas. They were decidedly less well-maintained than the east units. Dust filled the crevices in the interior, and the windows were so caked in frost as to be almost opaque. The thick black vinyl of the bench upholstery had large spiderwebbing cracks spanning the surfaces. I almost felt bad sitting down because I feared it falling apart further. "Get that rope out I had you bring," Sarah instructed. I reopened my pack and grabbed the coil, needing to untangle a couple items from it before it was free. Sarah grabbed it for me and unclipped 2 carabiners she had at loops around her waist. She began tying the ends to a carabiner each. The task gave her some time to relax. Sarah tended to get short-fused when needing to deal with her RPV administrational duties. I generally tried to avoid her area of effect when at work. The gondola continued to ride down the hill. The pulleys on the cable support poles squealed in protest as we drifted past. I wasn't sure where we were heading, so I sat idly thinking, watching Sarah tie her knots. She stood up and gave her new rope terminations a tug. "We'll get off at the next platform," she instructed, and slid open the left gondola door. The cold air swept in, and I could see the surroundings for the first time since getting in. The west side settlement looked much like the east side. The buildings were of the same construction and arranged in the same horizontal rows. The largest difference was the obvious lack of maintenance. Snowdrifts spanned some of the distances between the buildings, sometimes cresting the tops of 2-story buildings. Some of the metal roofed structures had been left uncapped where the metal had disintegrated in the elements. Cracks had formed in the walls of some of the buildings, and a few more had whole sections crumbling, resting in piles. We put on our gear as we made it to the platform and hopped out as the gondola swung past. I started walking off, but Sarah grabbed my shoulder to stop me. When I turned around to see what was up, she clipped one of the carabiners to a thick loop in the front of my thermal suit. She had already clipped the other side to a similar loop on her suit. Sarah had her visor flipped up to talk to me. "All right, some basics. The deep snow is not our friend here. Around tall objects, it can get very soft where the wind has blown it in. If you get stuck, you're never getting out on your own. The snow can also cover up ravines and other hazards. I'm going to take lead here, so I need you to stay the full length of the rope behind me and keep most of the slack out." I flipped my visor shut and used the walkie-talkie hands that I had clipped to the front of my suit to radio back. "Roger that." Sarah flipped her visor down as well and started trekking out from the platform. She radioed back as she was walking away. "This is a pretty well-traveled route, so I don't expect any trouble. Just wanted you to be up to speed." "All good," I replied while I let the rope spool out of my right hand to ensure it wouldn't tangle. Once the rope had spooled all the way out, I started marching after her. She was walking faster than I expected, so I had to hop forward a bit at the start to keep from being yanked by the rope. I was following Sarah's footsteps about 15 meters behind. I took a closer look at her surroundings as we walked. It appeared to me that we were about halfway down the west slope of the mountain. We were walking down a branch street with residential buildings, much like our house, lining both sides. We walked for a couple 100 meters down this repeating row of houses before Sarah stopped and beckoned me to join her. She was positioned at the edge of the road at a couple-meter gap between buildings where not too much snow had piled up. "You can take your pack off for now. This will take a couple minutes," she instructed over the radio. I did, happy to take the weight off, and wandered a couple meters away to sit down on the front stairs of a nearby building. Sarah unclipped one of the sensor spikes from my pack and drove the chisel end into the ground a couple times. She watched it for a second to convince herself it would stay upright and returned to my pack. She pulled out the rectangular battery pack, hung it from the top of the spike with a built-in bracket, and clipped the large red and black alligator clips to two similarly colored terminals on the spike. "Can you help me out with something really quick?" she radioed, and then flipped up her visor. I got up from my seat, raised my own visor, and came over to take a look. She had started spooling out two small lines of cable from the top of the spike. Each cable had a carabiner on the end and a small metal spade attached to that. The cables had integral spools in the spike body, and I was impressed at how much tech they managed to fit into such a small space. I didn't remember seeing the spades on the device before, so Sarah must have brought them along. "Pull this cable out," she handed me one of the spades, "and press the anchor into the snow once you run out of cable." I spooled it out, careful not to pull too hard as to unseat the spike. Once at full draw, I found a patch of relatively dense snow and drove the spade in using my boot. I stepped back and waited. Sarah pressed a large red button on the top of the spike. The cables were drawn tight with a mechanical whir. It then started to vibrate with a cacophonous hammering sound. The chisel started plunging its way downward, and the noise increased as it pierced the snow and found the stone or concrete beneath. The cables provided support as the machine worked. We stood around the device as it slowly disappeared into the ground. It took no more than a couple minutes until only half of it remained above the snow. The hammering stopped abruptly, and Sarah approached to unclip the battery pack from the top. "So, what do these do exactly?" "I don't actually know," I asked, while she was packing up the battery. "Once we place these around this area, we should be able to measure the activity of the volcano more accurately. I'll spare you the details, but by comparing the differences in measurements between all the probes, we can create a three-dimensional map of sorts of the subterranean structure." "That's neat, I guess. But what was the rush in doing this today?" "So, a survey team noticed a fault line was releasing gas a couple days ago. That particular spot has been inactive for years. The fear is that a magma flow has recently encountered the existing voids in the bedrock. Any escape of magma could be dangerous to the city." I nodded. "So, where are we going next?" "We're actually going to that fault line now. It's almost due south of here." "Sick. Anything more we need to do here?" She playfully slapped my visor shut and radioed over. "Nope, we're good to go." We picked up our gear and started walking back towards the lift. Sarah still led the way with me in tow by one pitch of rope. The degradation of the buildings was even more apparent on the north faces, visible on the way back. The wind had started picking up since we left the first site. It scraped snow off surfaces and whipped it past us. Visibility was still fairly good, all things considered, but I was glad for the full-face helmet keeping the dusty snow out of my eyes. Nothing really stood out during the couple-minute march down the street. Snow and gray houses endless as I put one foot in front of another. It was likely only a couple minutes of travel, but I couldn't have discerned 5 minutes from 50. The wind droning and the snow plinking off my visor aided in the feeling of stagnant time. The monotony of the scenery was only broken by the lift coming into view out of the snow, but as we continued and passed underneath, it returned to more of the same. My quasi-hypnotic state was broken by the sharp static of Sarah radioing to me. "How you doing back there?" I fumbled for the push-to-talk button on my handset. "Just peachy keen. How much further are we going?" "We're almost there. Start watching your step now. There might be some more uneven terrain coming up. Sure enough, in another 100 meters or so, the road was cleft by a small fault, resulting in a meter drop. The shelf traveled both up and down the mountain from our position, and was slightly obscured by a snowdrift that had formed. I was worried about hidden gaps and holes surrounding the rift, but with Sarah quickly taking the slack out of the rope, I had to traverse the feature swiftly. The visibility was reducing quickly, and was now to the point at which I could only barely make out the outline of Sarah at the end of the rope in front of me. She detoured to the left of the road and hopped down another ledge to reach the wall of a large 2-story building. It was larger than any of the other buildings adjacent to it, and was missing its roof. Presumably it had disintegrated a long time ago. The building had a large metallic backlit sign spelling out RPVWPO. I think that stood for Reaper Point Volcanology West Post Office, but it had been a while since they explained all the acronyms to me. The wall Sarah had arrived at was missing a meter-square section at the bottom. The concrete that comprised that area was now littering the surroundings. Sarah crawled through the opening and disappeared into the darkness. I followed the snaking rope and crawled in after. I tumbled down to the floor and the contents of my pack clattered within it. Peeling myself off the floor and looking around greeted me with a dimly lit concrete room. I presumed that this was the basement of the building. The walls and floors constructed of the famous Reaper Point gray concrete, and the hole that we climbed in provided much of the light in the room. The wall to our right had a doorless door frame, presumably expanding to other rooms. The floor was littered with various detritus, scraps of paper, envelopes, bits of broken shelving, and other unidentifiable materials were thinly spread across the ground. There were metal filing cabinets lining the left wall, and those had held up enough to be largely in one piece. Every surface in the room was covered with a black dust that only aided in draining what little light existed here. The far wall held the most unusual aspect of the location. It was split by a large, jagged, vertical opening. It originated at the ceiling and continued deeper than the floor we stood on. It didn't open to the surface above, but instead only descended straight down into a black void. Its mouth was about 1.5 meters wide and seemed to continue snaking downward with a similar cross-section. Sarah had taken her pack off and was pulling out a small handheld device with a large front screen. She started walking to the mouth of the rift and stared intently at the display on her device. I followed a couple steps behind, trying to peer over her shoulder at what was so interesting on the screen. A warm draft emanated from the orifice and wafted past us. I started to smell sulfur and other noxious, hellish odors I couldn't describe with any justice. Small black flakes of something resembling ash floated on the draft on its way out. "Yep, that's active all right," Sarah said, breaking the silence. She pointed at one of the many numbers on the screen of the device. I didn't understand any of what I was looking at. "These readings have tripled since the last time I was here." She began walking back to her pack while I cautiously continued walking towards the open maw. I was only so confident in the structure of the flooring, but I got within 0.5 meter of the opening. I could see further in than before, but not by much. The crack zigzagged and wandered as it descended, and with the limited light, I couldn't see much further down than another 5 meters or so. I scoffed and muttered, "Creepy." I turned around and began walking back across the room. I asked, "You don't happen to have any chem lights, do you?" and chuckled to myself. Sarah just looked at me for a second, confused. You know, like in the movies when the main characters find a hole and they want to know how deep it goes, they drop a glow stick down. "God, you're an insufferable dork." She shook her head and finished retrieving the rectangular battery from her backpack. I cackled, amused with myself, and began freeing one of the seismograph probes from my pack. Once I had it free, I swung my pack on one shoulder and stood the probe upright on the tip of my right boot. In hindsight, it was silly to try to protect it from the ground, but it was force of habit. "Where are we placing this one?" "Probably just in the middle of the room. I can't think of any other better spot." Sarah pointed to the floor at the center of the room. I began to waddle over to the desired spot. The probe was still held in my right hand, with the tip on my boot, swinging with me as I took each step, I waited patiently while Sarah took one last look at her device before stuffing it back in the pack. She had the rectangular battery in her other hand. A problem occurred to me. How are we going to tie this one down? Sarah looked around for a second. Good question. I didn't really think of that. Unbelievable. You're supposed to be the expert, I jested. Oh, shush. I don't want to hear it. She had turned around to face the line of filing cabinets. Here, I'll just tuck this one under a cabinet. She pulled out one of the small spades from a pocket in her thermal suit and clipped it to the end of one of the probe tension cables closest to her. I held the probe upright while she dragged the cable out. She placed the spade on the floor and jammed it under with a swift kick of her boot. And what about this side? I asked, while wiggling the carabiner at the end of the other cable. Sarah turned back around and stared at me for a couple seconds with her hands on her hips. Just sit on it. I looked at her for a second. You've got to be joking. Nah, it'll be fine. I balked for a couple more moments. Okay, fine. Just give me one of those spades. I made a beckoning motion towards her. Spades? She said incredulously. You mean the anchors? Also, why? Just clip it to your backpack and sit on it. Oh, she's so smart, I exclaimed as I swung my pack around and clipped the cable to the top loop where the last probe was still attached. Sarah held the upright probe while I walked out a couple meters, placed the pack on the ground, and perched on top of it. And you were calling me too skinny to be an anchor earlier today. Sarah chuckled. That's what we all say when we get older. I scoffed, not exactly sure what she meant by that joke. Sarah tucked the probe in the crook of her elbow while she hooked up the leads of the battery. Sarah was still holding onto the top of the probe while she pressed the start button. The cables began to draw inwards. Once taut, the filing cabinet shifted and creaked slightly, but held firm. Apparently, Sarah was right, because the cable attached to me barely moved the combined weight of me and my pack on the floor. The hammering, bone-racking noise started abruptly. The concrete echo chamber we were in only acted to amplify the world-ending racket. I flipped the visor of my helmet shut, which dulled the noise a little, but the violent vibration could still be felt through the floor. The probe had dug a couple centimeters into the concrete before Sarah let go and stepped away a couple paces. The noise decreased a little since the chiseling was now happening beneath the surface, but it was still far too loud to converse. I started poking around my general area to keep myself entertained. The black soot that layered the floor was showing bare patches around me where it had rubbed off when I situated myself on the floor. The grime had covered parts of the legs of my thermal suit and was caked in the seams of my pack beneath me. I drew a smiley face in a patch of unmolested dust. Further playing with the dust, I picked up an envelope that was lying on the floor nearby. It left a pleasingly crisp rectangular patch of gray amongst the black. I tossed the envelope off to the side and reached out to grab another. Upon lifting it and creating a sequel clean patch, I noticed something different about this envelope. It was heavy. Too heavy for paper, but no more than a couple 100 grams. I wiped its blank white exterior clean of soot and noticed it was stiff and rigid. It didn't fold or bend easily. I tried to open the rear flap and didn't get very far. It moved a little, but just sprung back into place. It felt like the paper was instead made of metal that was bent into the shape of an envelope. Nothing about its appearance was out of the ordinary. I placed the odd envelope in my lap and continued picking up envelopes around me. I folded each one in half to see if they yielded normally. I tossed each normal envelope aside before reaching out to collect another. I found no more abnormalities, and was left with a pile of 6 or 7 folded envelopes to my left by the time the probe had finished its journey. I stood up and dusted myself off a bit while Sarah walked up and disconnected the battery pack from the probe. I unclipped my pack from the cable and slung it over my right shoulder. I had my souvenir in my left hand and extended it to Sarah to take a look at. She looked at my envelope and then to me. What, did you find a bit of juicy mail? No, just look at it. She took it from me and began turning it over. She experimentally tried bending it and generally explored the entire object. Goofy. I don't know. It's probably just like frozen or calcified or something. I scoffed. You're crazy. It's not just a frozen envelope. None of the others are like this. I pointed at my pile of folded envelopes. Jeez, origami clearly doesn't suit you. She handed the envelope back to me. Have it if you want. I don't think it's anything special. I'll keep it. I tucked it into a pocket in my pack. Sarah walked over to our entrance hole while I was preoccupied with stowing my item. Fucking shit. What? What's up? Suddenly I was worried. We've got a storm blowing in. By storm, you mean... Yeah, a hailstorm. Fuck. Sarah paced quickly and grabbed her radio headset. Joseph, this is Dr. Beckman. Can you hear me? Over. There were a couple seconds of silence. Joseph's voice came garbled over the radios. Dr. Beckman, I've been trying to reach you guys for like an hour. A hailstorm was hidden in that snow from earlier. Where are you guys right now? Yeah, I'm aware of that. She poked her head through the hole again. How bad is it? We're in the West Post Office. Hard to tell. It's at least Category 3. I had to shelter all the lifts. I've got nothing for you. He sounded genuinely apologetic. Sarah tapped the forehead of her helmet against the wall. My heart sank as Sarah replied, We'll stay the night here. Good work, Joseph. This concludes today's assembly. Tune in again for more of Reaper Point Volcanology. Until next time, have a good one.